to Proles Pod.
Hello, and welcome to Proles Pod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at Proles Pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/ProlesPod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. This episode is brought to you by the International Monetary Fund, which provided us with the coupon code ClassTrader that will get you a free security robot dog with your first purchase.
How generous.
So be sure to take advantage of that. Yeah, absolutely. Today, we're going to be talking about the Indigenous resistance in the Ecuadorian Amazon. But first, who do we have with us today?
Hi, it's me, Ray.
Hey, Ray.
Hi, and me, Martin.
Martin. Today's subject matter expert is Beth. And Beth Pitts is a writer-activist who has lived on the coast of Ecuador for the last 15 years. Since 2013, she has been working to support Indigenous communities in resistance to extractivism in their territories, especially in the Amazon. She's the author of 2 editions of The Moon Guide to Ecuador and Galapagos Islands, an internationally published travel guide with a focus on ethical travel. When not engaged in writing or activism, she spends her time guerrilla gardening and painting. It is nice to meet you, Beth. Say hi.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for coming on. All right. So I think you want to give a disclaimer here, Ray.
So as we get into this episode, maybe you heard from Beth's voice. I'm not sure if you picked up on that, but she is British and therefore not an Indigenous person native to the Ecuadorian Amazon. None of us on this episode are. And so before we get into the episode, I just want to offer a reminder here that we're not aiming to speak for or on behalf of Indigenous people. If you want to hear members of specifically the Siecopai community speak in their own words, you are welcome to head over to patreon.com/ProlesPod and listen to the full-length interview that my husband has painstakingly translated into English. And just so you all know, we do have their permission to both share the interview in its entirety and to carry out this episode.
Martine's work, coincidentally, on the interview also knocked a couple years off of his post-revolution gulag sentence. So congratulations
for being
to him.
a gaming comrade.
For being a gamer. All right. So I think we're going to start with Martine, correct? You're going to kind of give us a short, seriously this time, short history on, okay, yeah, go ahead and set us up for that, please.
Okay, so contrary to last time, which, it was a seriously lengthy primer for being a short primer, this one's like, I have it down to 2 pages, or even better, 1.5. So I've titled it Ecuador and Peru, Blurred Lines. If there ever was a country that can be easily balkanized, it's Ecuador. The territory we call today Ecuador has always contained multitudes and has always bounced around a lot. This modern conflict, although land-based, has always reflected Ecuador's lack of cohesion more than Peruvian ambition. That's not to say there wasn't any Peruvian ambition. There was always an opportunistic zeal for expansion, fueled mostly by centuries of half-hearted treaties. So, again, we have to go way back, but bear with me, we won't stay there for long, to the Incan Empire. Starting at the age of the señoríos étnicos, the ethnic lordships, modern Ecuador, what is now modern Ecuador, was made up of various fiefs like the Cañari, the Manteños, the Quitus, and the Caras, and more. Though resistance was fierce, these fiefdoms would eventually be conquered by the Inca Empire and become part of the Tahuantinsuyo, the larger empire, and in specific of the North Suyo, the Chinchasuyo, colonial times. After the conquista, most of Ecuador's territory would begin to take shape with the Real Audiencia de Quito, one of the divisions that belonged to the Viceroyalty of Peru, And later it would belong to the Viceroyalty of New Granada after the Viceroyalty of Peru was divided in two. Think of it as basically the first Viceroyalty of Peru was the whole South American continent. And that was just a Viceroyalty. So they said, yeah, better if we divide it. Post-Colonia. It is here where the conflict starts in earnest. During the Wars of Independence, New Granada is liberated first, becoming the Gran Colombia, encompassing modern-day Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Fearing encroachment by the independence movement, loyalists, or rather royalists, within the Department of Jaén, a dependency in the southernmost part of what is now Ecuador, in the province of Azuay, sends representatives to the Congress of Peru and declares itself part of the Viceroyalty of Peru and hence still part of the Spanish Empire. Independence leader Antonio José de Sucre would have none of that and demanded they swear allegiance to the Gran Colombian Constitution. And after refusal, the territory would be re-annexed after the Battle of Tarqui. In 1820, the Republic of Ecuador is founded, seceding from the Gran Colombia and retaining the three colonial provinces of Guayas, Quito, and Azuay. These territories included parts of modern Peru and Colombia. This would result in the first Ecuador-Peruvian War in 1857. Though more of a skirmish that resulted in zero changes in the status quo, it would signal the start of nearly a century of treaties that wouldn't prevent conflict. Going into the modern day, the War of 1941, that is the first modern conflict between the two parties. Though both sides disagree on what started the conflict, the matter of fact is that Ecuador was ill-equipped and outgunned, resulting in a grueling occupation and blockade by Peruvian forces to Ecuador. The conflict would end from pressure of the Allied powers, who wanted to project a united Western Hemisphere to the Axis powers during World War II. Peru would exit the Axis and join the Allies, and the Protocols of Rio de Janeiro, a treaty, was signed, giving both countries their modern borders. Afterwards, many an Ecuadorian president would later disavow the protocols and call them null and void, mostly alleging that they were signed under duress. It never got any traction in the international community besides the backing of Cuba, which is based, but it ended up not resulting in anything. Finally, in the wars of Paquisha in 81 and Cenepa in 95, both triggered by disputes on the validity of locations of outposts in the Cordillera del Condor, a small mountainous range in the border between the two countries. Both conflicts would be resolved quickly and with minimal casualties, but it would be solved definitely in 96 after the stalemate that was the Cenepa War would give both countries an out where they could declare themselves victor to their respective publics. With both parties accepting the Rio de Janeiro protocols, the establishment of a binational park and normalization of relations followed. A friend of the show, Bill Clinton, would even say, this signing. Oh, let me try the accent for a bit. I will do a straight one and then an accent one.
I cannot wait for this. I'm so excited.
This signing marks the end of the longest running source of international conflict in the Western Hemisphere.
That's not that bad.
And the straight one. The signing marks the end of the last and longest running source of armed international conflict in the Western Hemisphere.
What does it say about you that you're better at talking like Bill Clinton than you are talking like yourself?
I don't know. But also Bill Clinton is just like a more skeevy Matthew McConaughey. So it's actually kind of easy. Guess he didn't count the Mexican-American border in that statement.
Keep this man out of the gulag. He spends his whole time in the gulag making funny voices.
So that's about it for the primer. Now, some post-analysis on this conflict. Through Marxist-Leninist lens, one can see the insidiousness of chauvinism and the flawed nature of the modern liberal nation-state. During the dispute, it was mostly rural, reservists, and poor urbanites who died in the front as cannon fodder for both sides, showing that even small elites are as disconnected from the working class and can weaponize nationalism as good as any other elites in developed nations. Though it will be discussed further in the episode, the permeable and nigh unsurveillable nature of the Amazon before and during the conflict meant that most communities, both indigenous and colonists, lived in flux between the two states, eschewing any border as truly an imaginary construct until enforced. The liberal fairy tale of democracy peace theory, aka democracies don't go to war with each other, is put to rest with this case study forever. As flawed as these two democracies were, they had a similar level of representation and oligarchy as any other liberal Western country. Democracies do go to war with each other all the time. If there is profit to be made, polls to be ahead at, and yes, territory to be won, there will be war between so-called democracies. Finally, there is the fact of asymmetry. Though this conflict was between two countries with similar heritage, it is not entirely dissimilar from the Mexican-American War, where a severely disadvantaged state is goaded into a conflict for territorial gain. It's an asymmetry that persists to this day, as Ecuadorian education gives great emphasis on the border dispute and the shame of territorial loss, whilst Peruvian education barely touches it as no more than a footnote.
So the reason that this backstory is as important as it is because while we will discuss several communities in this episode, the primary community that we are speaking about and that we have spoken to, again, in the full interview that you can listen at the Patreon, is a community that is divided between the Ecuadorian and Peruvian borders. And so it's important that people understand regionally the reasons for this and also the impact that this has, and that the arbitrary constructs of the nation state continue to have on Indigenous peoples and their sovereignty. So let's just get right in. Beth, can you give us a little bit of background on the community that we're starting to talk about today, the Siecopai, and how you came to work with them?
Yes, of course. So first, I just wanted to reinforce what you said at the start, Ray, which is about not speaking on behalf of Indigenous peoples. I've been working with the Siecopai community of Sequoia de Molino for the last 4 years. I feel honored to have built up relationships of trust in the community and to have been given an insight into their culture. And while I do have their permission to communicate their story and their struggle to the English-speaking world, the only people who can speak with real authority on the Siecopai are members of that nationality. So I've been given a window into their world, but it's not the whole picture. I also wanted to add that the Siecopai, having communicated all their knowledge orally over countless generations, are very skilled speakers. I, on the other hand, am a writer by trade. And I don't come from generations of orators. I come from generations of awkward British introverts. So I'm somewhat outside my comfort zone on a podcast. With those caveats said, the Siecopai are an indigenous nationality living in the northern Amazon region of Ecuador and across the border into Peru. The word Siecopai means multicolored people in their native language, which is called Paikoka. Most Siecopai are bilingual in Paikoka and Spanish, although their elders speak only their native language. The Siecopai are also known as the Sequoia, and they're renowned for their skilled shamans and knowledge of medicinal plants, and they actually know how to use over 1,000 different medicinal plants. And actually, during the COVID pandemic, they invented a treatment for COVID that saved several lives and was so successful that they shared it with other indigenous nationalities. And they actually harvested some of the plants for their cure from Picaya, which is the ancestral territory they've just been awarded the title to. So while Big Pharma was making billions from the vaccines, the Siecopai were quietly sharing their own treatment, which was effective and had no side effects, but also no billion-dollar profit. So they're famous for their knowledge of plants. They're also famous for their excellent hot sauce, which is made from jungle peppers. And
it's like super surprising because Ecuadorian food and South American food in general, for those who don't know, is not spicy. And it is such a joyful relief to be able to eat spicy food in Ecuador.
Exactly. And they love it. And actually, they often say, if there's no hot sauce, it's not food.
Wow. I kind of want some now.
Mm-hmm. The Siecopai god is called Nainu Paina. And according to the Siecopai origin story, Nainu Paina came down from the sky to find their people living underground and liberated them to live on the surface. So there used to be around 30 or 40,000 Secopai, but there are currently only around 1,600 left. 900 in Peru, 700 in Ecuador. In Ecuador, they live in a fragment of rainforest surrounded by oil exploitation and palm oil monoculture plantations.
Do you know what accounts for the largest majority, I guess, of loss of population? Is it war? Is it like integration or?
I'm going to go into that a little bit later when I talk about the history, but it was actually introduced diseases in the 1600s.
Or that, yeah.
When the Jesuit missionaries came over, they introduced diseases which wiped out kind of 90% of the Secopai population.
Thanks, Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are 5 Secopai communities in Ecuador, of which only one remains in resistance, which is the community of Secoya de Molino, the community I've been working with. And the community consists of 53 families living on the banks of the Agua Rico River. And they have declared themselves in resistance. They've declared themselves to be conservationists. They have refused the incursion of extractive industries and the construction of roads within their territory. And actually, it's only their resistance which is preventing the state oil company from building a highway to exploit the Amazon all the way to Peru. And they are peacefully defending their 17,000 hectares of rainforest.
Also, notice how when indigenous people are in resistance and want to defy the borders of the nation state, this is seen as somehow anathema or violent. But when extractive industries want to do it, it's just sort of progress.
Par for the course.
Yes, exactly. And indigenous people in resistance usually get called terrorists, and they also get accused of holding up progress for the rest of the country, actually even by other indigenous people. So their neighboring community of San Pablo has cut down their forest to build oil palm, and the residents of San Pablo actually insult the residents of Secoya de Molino, saying that they're backward. Why don't you come into the 21st century? You don't have to be so poor. Get with the program, kind of stuff, you know.
In addition to, and I know we will probably touch this more deeply later, but in addition to this, because you can see it, right? When you drive off of that family's plot of land into the plot that's doing the agriculture, the monocropping, what ends up happening now is they're also having more floods because they don't have as many trees. They don't have the canopy, the top canopy of the rainforest. And so it's also contaminating the Remolinos community's river water. It's causing more problems with the fish that were in the river, which are already decreasing for like several other reasons. And so not only is it sort of like a verbal war or antagonism, I mean, on every plane, it's antagonistic against them, even within other people who are a part of the Secopai nation.
Exactly. But the community of San Pablo also serves as a cautionary tale, really, because the families in San Pablo earn about $500 a month each from oil palm, which is a lot of money.
It's higher than the national wage in Ecuador, right? The national minimum wage, it's a little bit higher.
Exactly. And so the community of Secoya de Molino sees that their neighbors are making this decent money, but they've also seen the impact of this in their neighbors' communities, especially in terms of alcoholism, drug addiction, suicide, violence. So they don't want any of that. So they're trying to go, they've chosen a different path.
And how did you come to work with them 4 years ago?
Well, I actually first encountered the Secopai when I was investigating for my book. And actually the reason I wrote my book was to support indigenous communities in resistance to extractivism. I'd learned that many jungle lodges in Ecuador, Amazon jungle lodges, are owned by tour agencies from Quito or foreigners. And these jungle lodges employ local indigenous people as cleaners, cooks, canoe drivers, and often they'll organize kind of visits with the guests to these people's communities, but it feels a bit like a human zoo, if you know what I mean. It just kind of feels a bit nasty. In these lodges, all the decisions are made by the tour agencies and all the income goes to them. And this is in the ancestral territory of indigenous peoples, many of whom have their own small-scale ecotourism initiatives, which are more authentic and where they have sovereignty, but they just don't have the budget to promote these projects. So I learned about that, and then I saw that the publishing company Moon was looking for an author to write their new edition on Ecuador. So I applied for the job because I saw the opportunity to recommend tourism projects owned by communities in resistance. So I was in the northern Amazon looking for exactly this kind of project. And I was recommended to meet Jimmy Piawahe, who's a young Sekopai defender. We actually met in a Chinese restaurant in the city of Lago Agrio. This is in 2018, and he told me about his community, Secoya de Molino. He told me about their struggle. He told me that the young people had founded an NGO called Fundación Será to defend their territory, preserve their ancestral traditions. And at that time, they had started preserving their ancestral knowledge of medicinal plants in audiovisual format. So they were accompanying the shamans while the shamans were out harvesting medicinal plants and recording the shamans harvesting the plants and talking about the plants in video format. And they'd also started organizing school workshops or knowledge sharing between elders, parents, and children. And I just thought, in my whole year of traveling for my book and meeting lots of activists, this was the most inspiring project that I'd heard of. So when I finished my book, I started working with them on a voluntary basis and helping them to organize. I'm a bit of an organizational ninja, you could say. Organizational skills are my superpower, and I put them at the disposal of the community.
Do you want to be a prole? We really need the help.
Tony's kind of got it.
So, organizational skills are not a prized cultural trait in Sekopai culture, you could say. I mean, traditional life, Sekopai life, doesn't really require organizational skills, but the forced introduction of capitalism has made it necessary for them to organize, to defend their territories and create sustainable sources of income. So that's where I come in, basically.
And I think that it's really interesting that you bring that up. And I think it's really important that you bring that up. Everyone on this call is either currently living in a country that we were not born in or has in the past. And as people who either live abroad or travel abroad, it's always kind of a contentious topic, right? Like what sustainable or conscious travel, whatever that means, sort of is and means. But when there are communities that are having to make the choice between tourism, right? Because it's forced upon them that they need to find a way to have income, tourism, making handicrafts and products and things like that, or they can choose extractive oil or palm or timber or selling parts of their land rights to poaching, right? It's sort of like there are times that the least damaging way to bring in income is to engage in tourism, and that there are, ethical or more ethical ways to do that. Moving on, outside of the tourism and their business endeavors, can you tell us a little bit about their lifeways, their way of life?
Of course. So traditionally, the Sekopai live communally in gigantic malokas, which are open-sided wooden huts with 40 to 60 people living under one roof. And that coexistence meant that people did everything together, shared everything. The men went hunting together, they shared the food. Everybody got up really early, usually around 3 a.m. to prepare and drink yoko, which is their version of coffee. And it's a drink made from a grated vine. So they literally just grate the vine and squeeze it into water. And it's a stimulant. And it does taste quite earthy. I imagine you, Ray and Martin, tried this drink while you were there.
I thought it was really nice.
So that's a sacred drink for them. So they would get up early, around 3 a.m. They would drink their yoko. They would tell stories and legends. They'd discuss what they would do that day, what the future would bring. And the children were there too. And this is how knowledge was passed on traditionally. And these days, the Sekopai still live in wooden huts, but not as communally. So each family has their own hut. And they still get up early, they still drink yoko, but not quite as early as before, more like 5 a.m. maybe. And there are other plants which are equally important to their way of life. So yoko is one. There's also yahe, which is ayahuasca, which is a purgative. So they're the three plants which are especially important to the Sekopai. And actually, they say that these three plants have enabled the survival of their culture over the millennia. and they call them the plants of resistance. And these plants kind of guide them in their struggle, in their resistance.
What is the function of the other two?
So ayahuasca is a potent hallucinogen, and it will provide vision. So, for example, I have a friend from the community, and she was considering investing their family money in oil palm. And then she took ayahuasca or yahe, as they would call it, for the first time. And she received a vision in that ceremony, which said to her, don't do it, don't do it. And these are the animals talking to her. The animals appeared in her vision. Don't do it. You're robbing us of our home. Please don't do it. Invest in something else. And it was literally such a clear message that they decided to invest in tourism instead of oil palm. So ayahuasca can provide very clear guidance.
Also, in the interview that you can hear at the Patreon, Jimmy tells a story about a young person in the community who died by suicide. And this served as a wake-up call because, as Beth was saying, the other families had varying degrees of connectedness to their ancestral traditions. And after this young person died by suicide, it was an enormous wake-up call that the community felt that they had lost their way, that they needed to reconnect with their medicine ceremonies. And through this, the elders and now a new generation of people is coming up with this information on how to conduct and engage with these ceremonies, received visions and ideas and inspiration to help them. And also with the Manyapu, I can speak on this because I personally have taken a lot of it. We spend time in the community because disability is a spectrum and I'm very much on it. And I was hitting a dead end with Western medicine. And so I have taken a lot of Manyapu. It is harvested wild. So this is not a community that has a history of agricultural practice. This is a community of people who are very skilled hunters and foragers. And it is harvested a wild tree. You find it mature enough so that the inside of it has this sort of blood red color. And in alignment with their cosmology, at least according to what I have been told, you're looking for the red, and the blood red color actually helps to purify the blood and to increase the circulation and the movement of the energy within the body. And so you drink it very early in the morning. You drink it all in one go. The more times you do it, the bigger the gourd they serve you is. It is unbelievable. You drink it all in one go without breathing, and then you purge, you vomit. Also, a note for the ayahuasca heads out there, of which I have many nuanced and strong opinions. Yahe varies slightly from ayahuasca in that it's the same plant, but it's a different preparation. And because, or maybe, I'm not sure that this is a causal relationship, but because there's Manyapu and also other medications like kansu and other plants that have a purgative effect, the yahe is not intended necessarily to have this effect. And as far as I know, the bark, which contains the sort of like tannins or the parts that agitate your digestion, is removed in the preparation of yahe in this region. And so it has less of a damage to your digestion, just in case that's an interesting fact for anybody.
Okay.
And I think these plant medicines also encourage the discipline of getting up early. They help conversation. They keep you mentally sharp, physically sharp, and kind of banish laziness.
Also, the collection of these plants, right? A couple times I have gone out to forage with members of the community, right? To harvest what will be my own medication. And you learn a lot about, again, the land and the patterns that are happening on the land and the growing season of the plants and things like that. Because again, these are not people with an agricultural history. They are foraging, and having to move through the land shows you like, oh, over here, this kind of plant is maturing. Oh, over here, I thought there would be more of this, but there wasn't. We should look to see what's happening, if something has happened or something like that. And so it's also kind of a continual relationship with the land that I think is, interesting and certainly diverges from most of our life ways.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, that's a nice segue in what I was going to talk about next, Ray, which is they do have some agriculture. So they grow a limited amount of crops in these small agricultural gardens called chakras. And historically, they had an amazing astronomical knowledge and would live according to the stars. So they would plant their crops according to the constellations. So, for example, when they wanted to plant corn, they would look at Orion's belt And when the center star was overhead, they would start planting their corn. And they still have their chakras, but a lot of this astronomical knowledge has sadly been lost. And their most common crops or most staple crops are yucca, which in English is cassava, plantain, and some fruits like papaya. And then from the yucca or cassava, they make flatbread, cassava tortillas. And the only ingredient is yucca or cassava, the only ingredient. And it's extremely long, involved process to harvest the yucca fresh and then through this long convoluted process turn it into tortillas over the fire, which you cook in a ceramic dish over the fire. And then traditionally they would hunt with spears. They do still hunt, but these days they hunt more with rifles. And Sequoia de Molino and actually many Amazon communities have drastically reduced their hunting in order to conserve the remaining wildlife. So there are a few species which they do still hunt, wild boars being one, agouti being another. But increasingly, they've turned to raising chickens for eggs and meat as a conservation effort, basically. And in the community of Sequoia de Molino, you're already seeing the results of their ban on hunting most animals because monkeys, sloths, toucans, all kinds of birds are coming right up and approaching the community, which is such a joy for them and also for the tourists. And actually recently there's been so much gun violence in Ecuador that the community of Sequoia de Molino are discussing whether they should go back to hunting with spears in the very traditional way.
I mean, you see this again and again, not specifically to the gun violence, but to the conservation efforts of the hunting. You see it again and again with indigenous communities in this region, where they're the ones engaging in reforestation. They're the ones engaging in conservation efforts. And they're also the people who get the rawest end of the deal regarding everyone else's climate destruction.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Hey there, leaders of the Global South. Did you know your little country might have cobalt reserves it isn't exploiting? Do you wish your water resources put money in your pockets instead of serving the people? Do you have a troublesome group of leftists threatening to take political power? Well, buddy, does the IMF have a deal for you? Hi, I'm Oswald Gark, and today I'd like to talk to you about our nation-destroying loans. You see, we will give you as much money as you want for your pet project. Want to build a rail system? A port? A military base? We've got you covered. And at interest rates you won't believe because they're so high. Can't afford to make your payments? Don't worry. Our structural adjustment package means we've got a dozen corporations in the global north ready to scoop up all those pesky public services you've got lying around. And we'll even hit you with some kickbacks in exchange for your complicity. If you act now, we'll even throw in a free robot dog, courtesy of Boston Dynamics. This baby can be outfitted with lethal and non-lethal projectiles, depending on how rowdy your constituents get as a result of your wanton actions. Call the IMF today at 1-800-Y-SELL-OUT. That's 1-800, the letter Y, sell out. And now, back to the show.
I think that for those of us raised in the West, the ideas of cosmology or storytelling can feel really foreign to us. Although, obviously, we all have our own creation myths of our faiths, our nation state, whatever it is. But I think that the Siekopai people use story and cosmology and storytelling differently. And I was wondering if you could share any of their history or their stories with us.
Yes, I actually have 3 short stories here. So historically, all of their knowledge, history, and legends were passed down orally up until today, while drinking the yoko, the pre-dawn kind of ceremonies, or also through daily practices such as hunting, fishing, building malokas. That's when the parents, the elders, would share their knowledge with the young people. So there are many ancestral stories. A lot of them are quite dark and disturbing, I have to say. So there was a while back, I was selling some necklaces to some people in North America and Canada, and I thought it would be nice to get some of the children in the community to write down their ancestral stories and do drawings to accompany the the stories so we could have a little book to accompany the necklaces. And actually, they were mostly extremely dark and disturbing. Some have a clear moral to the stories, others don't. They're kind of, to the Western ear, quite incomprehensible. So I'll tell you the story which came up most frequently when the children were writing their ancestral stories. And actually, these are stories which have been very, very rarely heard outside Sekopai Nation. So here we go. This is the story of the caterpillar woman. One day, a young man was hunting when he came across a gigantic caterpillar on a cassava leaf. To the caterpillar, he said, "If you were a real person, I would take you hunting with me, but you're just a caterpillar, bah." He struck the caterpillar on the shoulder with his machete and carried on his way. While he was fishing, he heard a voice behind him saying, "Ow, my back hurts, somebody's macheted me." When he turned around, the man found a young woman who was bleeding from a wound in her shoulder. He decided to take her home and heal her, but he didn't tell his family about his guest. In time, the young man and the caterpillar woman got married. One day, the young man went hunting, leaving his caterpillar wife wrapped in leaves in his room. That day, when he left to go hunting, he asked his mother not to touch the leaves in his room because they were very special. But his mother wasn't paying attention. When she started to tidy the house, she saw the mess of leaves in her son's room and asked herself, "Why does my son have so much rubbish lying around?" She picked up the leaves and started to burn them. She heard an explosion from inside the fire, but she didn't know what it was. When the young man got back from hunting, he found his room tidy with no leaves on the floor. In horror, he asked his mother what she had done with the leaves that he had asked her not to touch. She responded that she had burned them, and so he lost his caterpillar wife.
Everybody could use a caterpillar wife.
It's pretty brutal, and I remember asking Jimmy, "Okay, Jimmy, what's the moral of that story? Because it's quite devastating." And he said, "Well, I'm not sure. I think the moral's been lost over time." So he wasn't actually able to tell me what the moral of the story was.
Wonder if it has something to do with like moving or displacing like wildlife and stuff.
It could be. It could be.
There are so many stories like this. We don't have to keep this in, but there was a day that it was raining and Martin and I stayed at Lily and Antonio's house and they showed us the collection of children's books. And there's these lovely little animated children's books that are translated in Paikoka, Spanish and English. And I'm reading them. And there's one about the moon has a face because a brother tried to molest his sister and she slapped him. And the slap mark, the handprint on his face is the face of the moon. And then there's another one about the capuchin monkey being the natural midwife of the world. And there's a woman who sees the monkeys eating the fruit out of the trees, and her father, I think, like yells at the monkeys. But then later she goes into childbirth, but she was nice to the monkeys, and so the monkeys deliver her baby. And then this whole thing happens, and her husband was like cutting down a tree, and then the capuchin monkey comes over and is like, "What are you doing? Go see your wife." And he was like, "Didn't she have a C-section?" And she was like, "What the hell? No, she didn't have a C-section. We delivered her baby because obviously we're midwives." And then he runs back and gets his baby. And then it says explicitly that the moral of the story is that you should be kind to animals. And it's like, where would you get that from this story? I don't say that to be disparaging at all. And in fact, I think that when we came in and were working with them to help with their social media, and we tried to show them how to create content that would be engaging for a Western audience, we also had to introduce even concepts within storytelling of like a linear beginning, middle, and end, because the way that they tell stories is not the way that we understand stories.
Just go back and
please.
add something more I wanted to say about the Sekopai way of life, which I think might be relevant to your
I'm
listeners.
so sorry. Yes,
No, it's all good. Which is just about collective decision making. So they basically, it's basically anarchy in action. So all decisions are made collectively. They have a people's assembly, a general assembly of the whole community, and what the people says goes, essentially.
Right. And they have a practice, if I'm understanding correctly from what we've asked when we spoke with Jimmy, anyone who wants to have an opinion is like allowed to have an opinion. Anyone in the community that wants to spend the time to construct an argument and share their opinion is heard.
Exactly. So the meetings can be very long, quite painful, lots of people getting up and speaking. But, collective decision making is painful, but it works. It works.
Something that this makes me think of, the collective decision making, the consensus making, the democratic nature within the community. Recently, they have a pretty historic land back victory.
Mm-hmm.
It's not without its flaws. It's not without its complication. Not all of that is laid at the feet of the Secopai people, surely. But I was wondering if you could talk about the land back victory, what happened,
Mm-hmm.
and what is currently happening. Because again, those of us who are quite interested in Indigenous people and their victories and their struggles might have heard about this victory, but a lot has happened since the so-called victory. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So the Secopai made headlines at the end of last year when they won a historic legal victory that ruled that the Ecuadorian government had to award them the title to their ancestral territory, which in Spanish is called Lagarto Cocha. That's the name of the territory. Or in Paikoka is Picaya. So Picaya, I might be pronouncing that wrong. I'm not very good at pronouncing Paikoka, is a black lagoon environment on the border with Peru. It's 8 hours by motorized canoe from the community of Secoya de Molino. And it is the spiritual center of the Secopai. And they also see it as the gateway to the aquatic world. Historically, the great Secopai shamans from all corners of their territory gathered at the lagoons every August, which is their most sacred month, to perform yahe ceremonies accompanied by other indigenous peoples. So it's a very important spiritual center for them. And it was also home to several Secopai communities who had to abandon their territory in the 1940s when the war broke out between Ecuador and Peru. And suddenly there was a militarized border running through the middle of their territory. And when they tried to enter the area, they were met with violence, they were beaten, they were enslaved. And in the end, some Secopai communities and families did not see each other for half a century until the signing of the peace treaty in the 90s allowed for reunification. And then following the war, the Ecuadorian state saw Picaya as a lovely expanse of empty rainforest and signed it over to the Quichuas of Zancudo. So the Quichua is another nationality, Amazonian nationality of Ecuador. So they signed it over to some Quichua people from the community of Zancudo. And that prompted the Secopai to take the government to court to demand that the government return their ancestral territory to them. And in November 2023, they won. The court found in their favor, which was a huge surprise because they were telling me that the judge was pretty rude to them actually within the hearing and was saying things to them like, you don't even belong in this courtroom, you're not even Ecuadorian, you're Peruvian, things like that. So they didn't expect to win the court case, but they did. And it was a huge victory for them because they believe that their hopes of surviving as Secopai depend on their return to their ancestral territory. But sadly, and I guess unsurprisingly, the government is dragging its feet to uphold the ruling. So they haven't done it yet. And March 2024, the Secopai wrote an official letter to demand that the sentence be upheld. But so far, nothing. Meanwhile, the Secopai have been traveling to Picaya to bring back plants and fruit trees that are scarce in their territory where they currently live, or have even died out from their current territory so that they can reforest. So there are kind of rare fruit trees in their ancestral territory, and they've been going to Picaya to bring back samples so that they can reforest their current territory, which I think is wonderful. They can also harvest some plants there which are needed to make ceramics. But recently they had a very sad incident where there was a delegation of Secopai people, 18 Secopai people, including elderly people, children. They traveled to Picaya and they were attacked by the Quichuas of Zancudo. This happened in April. The Quichuas shot at their canoe with guns, pointed their guns at them, threatened them, threw their phones into the river to delete the evidence of the attack and forced them to leave. And they were forced to paddle to the closest village because their motor had been damaged in the attack. And then the Secopai had to send a team to rescue them. So it's really important that the government comply with the ruling and give them the title to their land, because hopefully that would prevent this kind of attack from happening in the future.
And this is something that I really want to highlight here, because again, like as an American, the point of reference that I think this flags for me is the sort of mythology of black on black crime, right? Not to suggest that it never happens, that people of a similar racialized group have violence between each other. However, when you step back, you can examine, like, there are external forces that are making people who would otherwise have a lot in common engage in armed conflict against one another, or violent conflict against one another. And so it is with this community. The indigenous peoples as a whole in the Ecuadorian Amazon historically have a tremendous amount of solidarity. But we see with the imposition of capitalism, with the encroaching of extractive systems and things like that, that suddenly these people who historically had very much in common and worked together for many things are now engaging in armed struggle against one another. And this, in a country and in a region and in a time that skews pretty racist, pretty classist, this just becomes more cannon fodder for the narratives that, oh, these Indians, as they say, you know, it's like used kind of as a slur in this region, right? These people are lazy, these people are violent, these people are always fighting against one another. And we see this as the basis for, well, I guess they're not taking care of their land, they're just fighting with one another, and so we can take it. And it's really important that we understand the material conditions that go into these conflicts, because then we can see that it's not just people arguing with each other out in canoes in the middle of the Amazon, it's actually being driven by capitalism, which kind of leads me to my next question, Beth, which is, how do you think that the violence of capitalism compromises, intrudes upon, or otherwise sort of impacts their lifeways? And we've mentioned the industries, we've mentioned the armed conflicts, but in the broader landscape, like, what are the threats that they're currently sort of facing?
Well, in recent decades, oil extraction and palm cultivation have put the Secopai at risk of physical and cultural extermination, essentially. The 700 Secopai surviving in Ecuador live in a fragment of rainforest surrounded by oil fields and monoculture palm oil plantations. Their rivers are contaminated by toxic waste from the palm oil industry. They also suffer from contamination from the gas flares that burn surplus gas at the oil fields. And they don't have oil exploitation within their territory, but it's close enough for them to be affected by it. And I've actually been reading recently that those gas flares can spread toxins for many, many kilometers. Also, the expanding network of roads is a huge threat. For several reasons. Encroaching roads allow invaders to enter the Secopai territory for illegal logging, hunting. So the roads make it easier for people to not only access their territory, but also remove natural resources, timber, animals and birds, for example. And this affects their community life. It affects the biodiversity of the forest, and also logging makes a lot of noise. The animals flee, and actually roads also allowed a group of long-term invaders to take up residence in Secopai territory when they were damaging the forest. And the Secopai spent years politely requesting them to leave, but in the end had to confront them with spears, burned their houses down and forced them to leave. And then roads also enable alcohol and drugs to enter Secopai communities. So due to all of these combined factors, contamination, deforestation, poaching, they've almost got no fish or animals left in their territory to hunt and gather. Food sovereignty is a big problem. They have many health problems.
No, I just want to underline this.
Yeah.
In the middle of the Amazon rainforest, food security is a problem. Like, there are children in this community who do not have enough to eat when they should have an overabundance of animals and plants and fish. And they're doing so much at the community level to sustain their lifeways and not harm the planet and just live, right? Like, literally just live and take care of their land. That helps everyone. And I say this because I sort of had the naive impression that, like, oh, it's the rainforest. There's just going to be, I don't know, papayas and bananas just falling out of the trees and just coconuts falling out of the sky. But no, they don't really have a tremendously diverse or nutritious diet. They subsist largely off of big portions of white rice, which is not native to this region, but it is affordable for them, you know, to feed their families. And I think that this is, like, incredibly shocking. And maybe people don't realize. I really want to underline that. And all of the things that Beth said earlier about the violence and the ecological damage of the gas and oil industry, those are the normal things. When she's talking about the gas flares, those are expected. Those are equipment that's already set up that has these huge fires that burn 24 hours a day. So just for listeners who maybe haven't been to these places, who don't really understand what oil extraction looks like, the things that she's talking about are the things that they prepare for. Those are the normal things. Those aren't the oil spills, the pipelines bursting, fires happening unexpectedly, which creates tremendous, astronomical levels of damage in addition to the damage that's already happening with the fossil fuel industry. And I just want to underline that, because I think that if you haven't been there or if you aren't familiar with it, you wouldn't necessarily know that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you asked me, how does the violence of capitalism intrude upon their way of life? I actually just wanted to read a brief quote from Jimmy, which I think says it quite nicely. And he said, "The economic issue is one of the main drivers of destruction in the Amazon. The manufactured need for money is why there is so much deforestation and the animals are becoming extinct. And yet, Amazonian communities need money like everyone else. Those who say that money doesn't exist in the indigenous world don't live in reality. Indigenous peoples need money because this need has been created in our communities by the outside world." End quote. So I think that kind of sums it up.
I think it obviously draws very similar parallels to what we we as Europeans did in North America with regards to the evisceration of the buffalo, right, is a big one, right? Primarily propagated by the indigenous tribes themselves. And so if you look at the numbers or whatever, you're like, wow, they did that to themselves, without realizing that it was all a result of kind of what you're talking about, like the necessity for money that Europeans created within these communities, then driving them to seek profit and essentially exterminate an entire species of animal that were previously their food source.
That's so true. And I think that sometimes we look at examples like Palestine, like Gaza right now, and we can see that there is a very clear, well-articulated, intentional objective to exterminate a population. And we go, oh, that's a genocide. But then we look at things like this, and we have decades of information where they know about the violence of extractive industries, where they know about the harm of fossil fuels and deforestation, where we know what poverty does to people through multi-generational timelines. And this isn't just the slow march of progress, right? This is absolutely and intentionally a genocide of indigenous people in this region.
Right. Yeah. Just because it doesn't come at the end of a gun or a bomb or something doesn't mean that it's not genocide.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I just wanted to go back to what you were saying earlier, Ray, that, you were expecting in the middle of the Amazon, there would be, fruit and fish and, food sovereignty wouldn't be a problem. But, indigenous peoples have been forced to live in a globalized capitalist world. And there are many people who think that somehow indigenous people are too pure to deal with money somehow, that they should just keep living as they did before and finding everything they need in the forest. But they can't anymore, because the forest no longer has the animals, the fish, the clean water to drink. So they need to generate income, and they also need to generate income. The thing I think makes me most sad is that they need to generate income in order to deal with the constant health problems caused by contamination, because their ancestral plant medicine can't deal with these health problems. So the family I know most closely in the community, a small family, in the past year, the grandma's been treated for ovarian cancer, the granddad's been treated for chronic anemia, one of the daughters has severe epileptic fits, she loses consciousness for hours at a time, another has migraines, nosebleeds, and the daughter had an emergency appendix surgery. And this is just one small family in a year. And there's no way of knowing for sure that all of this was caused by contamination. But considering that they're living in the middle of the forest and eating natural food, it seems unlikely that all this would just happen to this family. So,
in addition to, we have records. They keep their own records of their family members, right? And you can ask people, and in living memory, when they talk about their own grandparents, they're just like, no, literally everyone I know, every elder I know just died. They got old and they just died. I've never I didn't grow up. I'm speaking to people in the community telling me about their own elders, ancestors, grandparents. Like, I never saw my father get sick. I never saw my grandmother get sick. Nobody in my family was ever sick until very recently. And so I think that should be taken into consideration too, because it's a separate account of like hundreds of different people.
Yeah. And the reason that they can't pay for their medical bills is because they've decided not to cut down their forest. So if they decide to cut down their forest, they would make $500 a month like their neighbors. But they've decided not to. So that now they can't pay their medical bills for treatments that they only need because of this contamination. I mean, that really makes me mad, you know? And then another reason that they need money is to educate their children. This is a huge driver of deforestation. And it took me quite a while to get my head around this. I remember asking one of my main heroes, Jose Gualinga, from a community called Sarayaku, which I'll talk about later. What are the two main threats to the Amazon? And he said oil exploitation and education, the current education system. And I was so surprised. I mean, Ecuador is a country where you can only really get ahead, I guess, in any way if you have a university degree. And that's very expensive for indigenous people. So the need for this type of...
It also comes at a high social cost, right? Because there's not a university anywhere near where they live. So if you want a university degree, in addition to the financial cost, you're also separated from your family, from your network of support.
Right. You have to go live in the city, essentially.
Exactly.
And then, so the need for this type of education, which was introduced by the outside world, is a huge driver of deforestation. So people end up felling their forest to plant African palm so that they can educate their kids. And also the poachers and illegal loggers often have the same motivation. So when there's no work, people turn to fishing, hunting, felling trees to make money. They sell the wood for pennies, essentially, to send their kids to university. And then to deal with those invaders, the community of Secura de Molino created a territorial monitoring team. So they patrol the forest and they frequently confront armed poachers, which can lead to, actual violence. Obviously, I mean, when I was there, they confronted a poacher who just killed a puma, and sadly, the puma is already dead. But I mean, and this kind of stems from the need to educate. These poachers are doing that so they can educate their kids. It's so sad. And then the education system itself is capitalist. So it's kind of, teaching young people to be obedient employees in corporations, to put a dollar sign on everything. So there have been some Sekopai who go to study in the city, and then they come back and they exploit the natural resources of indigenous communities using their university education as a justification. So the higher education system is a double threat. So people cut down their trees so their children can go to university and be educated in a system of thought that leads to more destruction in itself.
And one of the things I just want to highlight for listeners is there are so many things that you might be listening to right now and being like, this is so fucked up. This is so fucking outraged. And all of those lifeways, the desire to be close to your own land, to be close to your own family, like these things were taken from us too, right? And we're just watching this encroachment in real time. And I say this because, again, I think that we sort of like take for granted, like, oh, you just go to the city to go to school. Like, oh, you just go to the city. I guess people just like move. People just do things. And it's like, it's never occurred to probably a lot of people listening right now, if you're in the West, if you're in the imperial core, especially that, but increasingly in the rest of the world, in the periphery, that you actually have a right to live near your family. You actually have a right to receive quality education where you are. You actually have a right to clean air and clean drinking water, and you don't have to pay the price of extraction and pollution in order to receive an education or get a job so that you can continue to face the decisions to further exploit your land, your family, your body, your time, your life, etc., or fall into further precarity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I remember speaking to a young man from the community of Sarayaku, a Quechua community. He wanted to go to university and study in Quito, but he didn't really have much money. So he was trying to live in an abandoned building because he had no money for rent. In Quito, it's so cold, and he was so cold. And he was trying to live on bananas and plantains sent to him by the community, sent to him by delivery in Quito. And he managed to keep it up for a few months, but in the end, he just couldn't do it. It's just too hard. So there are these complications which are experienced by Indigenous communities, and most of these complications are unknown to the outside world, really.
Not only unknown to the outside world, foregone in a way, right? Like not even unknown, kind of known and taken for granted. Like, yeah, this is just like what you do to live in modernity. And part of the reason that I, this was actually, by the way, when I had my first interview with the Proles, this was the episode that I wanted to do. And it's because like, I think that there's so much that we can learn from these communities, even though they're not expressly Marx-Leninist, they're not socialist, but there's so much that we can learn about. Of course, as Marx-Leninists, we're always examining the material conditions of the present in order to construct a better future. But also seeing the way that these people live as a result of slightly different origins and material conditions, we can see other diverging possibilities, right? And part of that is checking our own assumptions for being like, no, these conclusions are not foregone. Actually, it's crazy that somebody would have to travel across the country, freeze his ass off, and live off of fucking bananas in order to go to school. That's actually something that we should second guess.
And it's not even like this is the only way. I mean, I know Tony has done now 2 episodes on his other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism, in which he's talked about indigenous communities within the Soviet Union. And the way that they handled these problems was, with humanity, and the way that they preserved languages and ways of life, the way that they indigenous communities had access to more education and food diet types, like when they would go to school, if they had restrictive diets based upon their cultural heritage, they would have basically a cafeteria that made special food for them so that they're not having to just eat the food that everybody else is eating, because their stomachs are not made to handle it, and so on and so forth, right? This isn't the only way. And obviously we can learn a lot from this, but we can also learn that there has been something else, right? That there was other alternatives. This is not the only way that we can move into the modern age, is by destroying entire communities.
Yeah, and then also recognizing what a great service that they're doing for humanity by protecting the Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Which so far, our first hour or so in, it's been pretty down. But speaking of the protection and speaking of also especially Sarayaku, are there other inspiring examples of indigenous resistance in Ecuador or more broadly in the region?
Could I talk a little bit first about the resistance of the Secoya Remolino community?
Absolutely.
Because they're actually doing some really amazing things. So they've declared themselves in resistance, as I mentioned before, and they're in the process of weaving a tapestry of resistance with many threads. And they're working in a number of areas. So they're working to improve their food sovereignty, conserve the biodiversity of their territory, transform the education in their community, diversify their sources of sustainable income, and preserve the knowledge of traditions of their ancestors. So they've got a number of really innovative projects, and running through these projects is a common thread or theme, which is mixing ancestral wisdom with modern knowledge. And as I mentioned before, their whole resistance has been guided by the plants of resistance, which has guided them throughout on their journey. So the projects we're working on mostly at the moment is a plant laboratory project. So we're in the process of building a medicinal plant laboratory, which will bring their ancient knowledge of plant medicine into the 21st century. So we can experiment with plant extracts using modern techniques. And this should also provide them with a sustainable source of income. So ancestrally, they've been making products for the skin and hair there's a fruit called morete and there's another fruit called ungarawa. And these fruit grow on really tall palm trees. And traditionally, They would extract the oil, cooking the fruit over a bonfire with firewood. And now they have a cold press. This allows them to get greater yield so they can actually sell their products to other communities and also at fairs. And we've been working with our amazing allies at an NGO called Big Canopy Campout. We raised funds for a distillation still. So now they can make citronella oil. So now they can make insect repellent. And actually, they pioneered a new oil. There's a leaf you might have seen in videos or maybe in real life of a shaman who has a bunch of leaves and he shakes them over somebody to cleanse their energy. And the community had the idea of distilling the leaves of this plant. And it's called hoja de mal aire, which is like saying the leaf of bad air. So it's the leaf that you use to cure bad energy, or if a bad spirit enters your body. They used these leaves to get rid of that bad energy or bad spirit. And they distilled the oil and it just turned into this delicious smelling oil. And as far as we know, nobody's ever distilled this oil before. So we're kind of pioneers in that.
Nice.
So we're going to be selling that. And then we visited the community with some expert herbalists last year to help them develop new products like face masks. So they make ancestral ceramics with clay from their riverbanks. They've never thought to put the clay on their faces. So we had quite a fun evening with the women putting clay on our faces. It took a bit of persuading them to put clay on their faces initially. But actually we had a lot of fun and our skin felt amazing the next day. So they're going to be making clay face masks and moisturizing creams. So we're working at the moment to build a laboratory that will meet specification required for a government-issued hygiene certificate, which means we can sell online and in shops all over the country. So we're just starting to construct the laboratory at the moment. So that's a really exciting project.
Also, another really important thing for those of us who are on the strongly anti-capitalist left, that in order to build a more beautiful and more equitable future, we sincerely have to offer people alternatives to the things that they're interested in now. And I think that it's really important. I'm really glad that you took the time to unpack that, Beth, because I think that it's something that we can forget about, especially those of us who are the choir, right? We're sold, right? And we understand, oh, sure, yes, maybe I would have to sacrifice this thing or that thing. But the reality is to win over large populations. I mean, we've seen this historically, right? Especially with young people, they feel attracted to consumerism. Not that in this case, organic skincare is inherently consumerist or anything like that, but that they feel attracted to products or skincare or different things. And the front line of resistance can mean so many different things. And that includes offering people viable alternatives to the things that they're interested in now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess I used to think that resistance, it made me think of armed struggle or something like that, or direct action. But really, I think the most important way that the community can resist is finding sustainable sources of income, because that enables them to keep saying no to the extractive industries. When they have their assemblies, if they have a robust alternative economy, they can keep saying no. And the oil companies do sneaky things like, for example, they voted no to oil extraction in their territory. Then the oil company employees will turn up with chickens and say, oh, can we just let us have a little look around and we'll give you these chickens. And if people have got enough money to get by, they can say, no, we don't want your chickens, we're fine. But if they're hungry, they don't have enough to eat, they're tempted to say, oh, I could do with a chicken. Maybe I'll let them come in and have a look around, So I think actually sustainable source of income is the most important way that they can keep resisting.
Sure, yeah, especially with a community as small as theirs.
Yes, exactly. We've got another exciting project, which is the climbing team. So our amazing allies, I mentioned before, Big Canopy Campout, trained 8 members of the community in tree climbing techniques and donated professional tree climbing equipment so they can harvest fruit without felling the trees. So the trees I mentioned before, morete and ongarawa, they can use them for all kinds of things. Juice, jam, cooking oil, face oil, hair oil. But the trees are really tall. Morete can be up to 35 meters. So before, there would be this abundance of fruit just rotting at the top of the trees or being eaten by animals because the community didn't want to fell the trees. And it's dangerous to try and climb up there because the palms have no branches. And now with these new tree climbing techniques, they can harvest the fruit safely, which is super exciting. And then the next step is going to be using the tree climbing techniques to put camera traps up in the tops of the trees, so we can start investigating the ecosystem at the canopy level. So that's super exciting.
And they can safely take the seeds. I'm sharing this from a conversation that Martin and I had with Antonio when we were last in the community. They can also take the seeds from the trees, right, to help with the reforestation project, which previously it was sort of like, well, if they fell and no animals got them and they could get to them in time, maybe that was a possibility, but now they can do it quite intentionally, which again, I think that you're right. For us in the urbanized West, or in the westernized world, maybe because of our material conditions, sometimes direct action is the thing that is most meaningful or moves the needle forward for us as individuals, but it's not true for everyone. And I think that through this conversation, one of the most important things, again, is just broadening our perception of what that sort of front line of resistance is. And so on that train, now that we've discussed a little bit about what this specific community is doing, are there other examples of other communities who are doing inspiring or interesting things that we can learn from or can help us see things in a different way?
There are so many. It was actually quite hard to pick just a few. First of all, I just wanted to mention the Indigenous movement in Ecuador as a whole, which is extremely impressive. And it's one of the strongest on the continent, actually, due to its ability to mobilize a diverse range of ethnic groups. So the first major uprising or rebellion by the Indigenous movement in Ecuador was in 1990. And since then, and that protest actually blocked roads, cut off the food supply to the cities, and basically shut the country down for a week. And since then, there have been several uprisings or rebellions, two of which resulted in the overthrow of presidents. So it really has some clout, the Indigenous movement in Ecuador, and often extractivism is a major cause of these uprisings. I didn't really realize how amazing this was until I was participating in a protest in London in October 2019, and it was a protest by Extinction Rebellion. And our aim was to paralyze 12 sites across London for 2 weeks. And in order to try and achieve that, we had countless workshops, so many online meetings. We had 1 million different communications platforms, Telegram, Signal, Slack. We had Google documents everywhere. We had social media campaigns. We had so many resources being donated to the cause. And after all of that, we managed to paralyze maybe 10 sites across London for 3 days or something like that. At the same time, while I was protesting in London, there was a huge uprising here in Ecuador. And this was a low-tech movement with low resources. You know, some people actually walked all the way from the Amazon to the capital city of Quito to participate. And they managed to paralyze the whole country for 2 weeks. It's just so impressive. It's so impressive. And then thinking about specific examples, I think for me, the most inspiring example is the native people of Sariyaku. So they're an indigenous Quechua group with 1,400 people. They live in a remote part of Ecuador's southern Amazon, and they've been defending the Amazon and the rights of its peoples for 30 years now. And I've been working with one of their great leaders, Jose Gualinga, for 10 years now, translating, writing. And I kind of see them as the Jedi masters of peaceful resistance. I mean, they're amazing. They call themselves the people of noon, and that refers to an ancient prophecy of their ancestors, claiming that they would be a pillar of resistance after other communities had surrendered, a beacon of light as strong as the midday sun. And actually, I went there with a delegation of young Sekopai in 2022 so that we could learn, because the Sariyaku are 1,000 miles further on the path of resistance than the Sequoia Remolino, the community of Sequoia Remolino. So I went there to see what we could learn from them. And it was actually the first time that a delegation of Sekopai had visited Sariyaku. And when we got there, Jose Gualinga told us that his father, who had actually recently died when we arrived, he was the great spiritual leader of Sariyaku and their most eminent shaman. He was called Sabino Gualinga. He'd actually visited Sekopai territory in his youth And he'd traveled there by canoe to learn from the Sekopai shamans. And he'd achieved such a high level of knowledge that he transformed into a jaguar. And instead of returning to Sarayaku by river, he traveled back through the forest in his feline form. And it was amazing to know that these two communities had forged a connection several decades ago, which had kind of remained dormant until our visit. And actually, since our visit, their brotherhood has continued. There's been several visits between the two communities and much solidarity between them, which is super exciting. So the Sarayaku are best known for winning a historic victory at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in 2012, when the court found that the Ecuadorian state had violated their rights by allowing an oil company to prospect in their territory without consultation. And a turning point in the case was when Jose Gualinga's father, the old shaman, Don Sabino, he was aged 92 at the time. He took the witness stand in court, and he was asked about the impact of the 1,400 kilograms of explosives that had been planted in Sarayaku territory by the oil company. And he spoke about the invisible beings or spirits that had been disturbed by the explosions. And he said, half of the masters of the jungle are no longer there. It is a living forest. There are trees and medicinal plants and all kinds of beings. Many hid, others died when it burst. They are the ones who maintain the jungle, the forest. All of these who wish to cause damage, they don't understand what they are doing, but we do understand it because we see it. And then based on that kind of testimony, the court found in favor of the Sarayaku, and the Ecuadorian government had to apologize, and now their territory is sovereign, which is super cool.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. And there's actually a documentary about their court victory on YouTube called Children of the Jaguar. We can put the link in the show notes there.
Yeah.
And the same year in 2012, they created this amazing proposal called the Kausak-Sacha Living Forest Declaration, which asserts that as a living entity, their territory is subject to legal rights and demanding that those rights be upheld. And I love the story of this proposal because it actually came from the living forest. So in the Indigenous world, the highest form of knowledge that anybody can achieve is the ability to communicate with the forest itself. And Jose Gualinga's father had that ability, and it's ability which a lot of shamans don't have anymore, because in order to achieve that level of knowledge, you have to have a very restricted diet, often long periods of celibacy. You have to make a lot of sacrifices to get to this level of knowledge, and he had it. And the living forest communicated the idea of this proposal to him and the other wise elders. And they communicated it to the community in Quechua, and then the community decided to enact it. And then they communicated it to the outside world. And they actually presented this proposal at the Global Climate Change Conference, COP21 in Paris, to the President of France as well. And actually, to mark the occasion, they transported a canoe from their territory in the Ecuadorian Amazon all the way to Paris and sailed it down the Seine. I mean, they're just amazing. They're absolutely amazing. They've created a professional football team called the Children of the Jaguar, because they know that Ecuadorian people love football. And the best way very effective way to communicate a message in Ecuador is associating it with football. And they hired a professional football coach to come and teach their young people to play football, and they're actually really good. And they actually used the compensation from their 2012 court victory to found the only Indigenous-owned airline in Latin America, which took me a while to get my head around initially, but they see kind of small-scale air travel as a alternative to the expanding network of roads in the Amazon. And their airline prioritizes transporting Amazon defenders. They offer emergency evacuation to Indigenous communities. For example, if somebody's bitten by a snake, they will evacuate them and take them to medical facilities, and they refuse to serve any extractive industry, and then they share the profits from their airline among the community. They have created a school called the School of Peaceful Resistance, which they founded specifically to create revolutionaries, which I think is a wonderful idea. where they learn about their own ancestral traditions. So that's another one of their amazing projects. And actually something they've done more recently, which is a real inspiration for me. So the Ecuadorian government at the moment is trying to auction off 3 million hectares of largely virgin rainforest in the southern Amazon region. And it includes nearly all of the Sariaku territory. And to represent their peaceful resistance to extractivism, they are planting a perimeter of flowering trees around their territory. And it's called the Sisenyampi, and it symbolizes the fragility of life and their peaceful commitment to defend their territory. And their territory is actually 135,000 hectares. So it's going to take decades to plant this border of flowering trees. And that's actually what inspired my own guerrilla gardening project. The oceanfront road here where I live, I heard that it was under threat of development. And I thought, I could combat this bureaucratically and do thousands of endless, interminable, boring meetings, or I could just start planting a garden. So we started planting a garden, and so far it's stayed safe. So far there's been no development, and that was directly inspired by the Sariaku. So for me, they are the most inspiring example of indigenous resistance in Ecuador.
We've talked a lot about the oil industry, but what we haven't, and we've touched on it, but I don't want to pass up the opportunity to also talk about Yasuni for people who don't know. So can you tell us a little bit about the struggle to keep the oil in the ground in Yasuni National Park?
Yes, of course. So Yasuni National Park is arguably the most biodiverse spot on the whole planet. It's found in Ecuador's Amazon region, actually not too far from Sequoia de Molino. Tragically, over 30% of Ecuador's remaining oil reserves lie beneath the soil of the national park. And there have been several oil fields operating within the national park for decades, but there is one oil block called ITT, which is really controversial because it encroaches on the territories of the country's last 2 uncontacted tribes, who are called the Chajiri and the Taromenani. And I mean, amazingly, there are still 2 uncontacted tribes living a semi-nomadic life within the national park, the Yasuni National Park. And this oil field or oil block encroaches on their territory. So according to Ecuador's own constitution, exploiting for oil in that area is considered ethnocide. So in 2007, Rafael Correa's government hit the international headlines when it launched the Yasuni ITT initiative. And that offered to refrain from exploiting the oil field in exchange for 50% of the value of the reserves, or $3.6 billion from the international community. But then he went on to cancel the initiative in 2013, and he blamed foreign nations for their lack of support. And he declared that drilling would go ahead. But actually, it later came out, leaked documents published in The Guardian showed that the government was actually in negotiations with a Chinese oil company to drill the ITT field, even while Correa was seeking donations from the international community to protect it. And actually, the infrastructure was already being built. So when he announced that the drilling would go ahead, the Ecuadorian public was so outraged. There were mass demonstrations. And there's a clause in the Ecuadorian constitution that obliges the government to hold a public referendum if 5% of the voting population, or 60,000 people, sign a petition requesting on any particular topic. And the government calmed the situation by promising a referendum if the public could collect enough signatures in favour of leaving the oil underground. And there was a massive national effort that collected over 750,000 signatures, which were delivered to the National Electoral Commission, where they were due to be counted and verified in a transparent manner. But 5 days later, the signatures, or the boxes of signatures, were seized by the military and anti-riot police, who violently repressed activists with tear gas and stun guns as they tried to protect the boxes of signatures. And then the signatures were moved to a military enclosure in secret and counted behind closed doors. And not surprisingly, 60% of the signatures were rejected for bullshit reasons, such as the signatures being outside the box, the signature was in the wrong color ink, or there was a stain on the page.
The hanging Chad, the pregnant Chad.
So, then it was declared that there weren't not enough signatures had been collected, and the drilling would go ahead. So in 2016, the state oil company Petroecuador began drilling in the ITT block, and I drilled 153 wells by 2020 with plans for 100 more. And then in September 2022, after nearly a decade of pressure from civil society groups, an Ecuadorian court ruled that the signatures collected in 2013 were in fact valid. So another referendum was organized. And then when the referendum finally took place, the public voted overwhelmingly in favor of halting all new oil expansion activity, closing the existing wells, and removing all oil infrastructure. I think it was about 70% in favor of that. And that was all over the international news as a big win for conservation. But the government quickly and very quietly announced that it may not, in fact, honour the result. And it remains to be seen whether the President Daniel Noboa will, in fact, abide by the will of the people. But so far, it's not looking good.
I think that there are so many parallels here. So I'm from a Rust Belt Appalachian place where we had our own extractive industries. Obviously, I'm from a place that's close to where there was mass strip mining, there were steel mills, things like that. And I think that maybe listeners who've never been to Ecuador, they don't know a lot of Ecuadorian people, they might think that, I don't know, Ecuadorians are somehow uniquely like hippie, or they love gardening, all of them, or something like that. But actually, oil industry is one of the largest employers in the entire country, right? And yet, even still, so there's this like pervasive mythology, right, that the average Ecuadorian is always going to be in favor of oil drilling. But when people are asked time and time and time and time again, they're not. They're aware of the ecological damage. Yes, are there individuals who benefit financially from working in whatever kind of industry? But largely those are sort of PMCs, right? Like they're people that are higher up. The average worker, the average manual laborer is like more than happy to leave oil behind and find other ways. And again, I'm saying this for anyone who has maybe heard some other interviews where AOC, for example, on Jacobin, was talking about the need that the Ecuadorian people have for the money that comes from oil. And one, again, plenty of Ecuadorian people are happy to find other ways to earn money. And two, in practice, average working people, once again, are not receiving the money, are not receiving the wealth, are receiving crumbs at the bottom of this. Just something to think about here. But again, the parallels are endless, that working people are always characterized as people who love extraction, who love these industries, and we have to continue doing it for them. But when the most marginalized people are asked time and time and time again, and Beth hasn't touched on it, but there are many people, there are many indigenous people who have to take part-time or seasonal or full-time jobs in mines, in oil extraction. So it's not that these people have nothing to do with these industries. They absolutely do. But when the most marginalized people are asked time and time and time again, they're always in favor of honoring the environment, protecting the ecosystems, because they're aware that it impacts their own land, their bodies, their water, their lives.
Yes, and that's despite the propaganda was relentless. I mean, Rafael Correa's government released these adverts depicting exploiting in Yasuni as the equivalent of a mother lovingly vaccinating her child. So it'd be like a little prick of pain, but it would be beneficial for the whole body and all of life, essentially. And it was very kind of slick advert.
And not to map one country's politics onto another, but again, you know, as Beth and I have talked about off mic, it's very similar to the kind of AMLO narrative, the Correa government, that he was this democratically elected, I don't know, Mao Zedong figure who was going to come and bring about, both from the left and the right, that was going to come bring about socialism, and people felt whatever they feel about that. And in reality, I mean, this was just not the case at all.
Yeah, I mean, he came in, he wore a poncho, he spoke Quechua. He was saying it's time for humans to be the protectors of nature and not its destroyers. You know, Indigenous defenders voted for him when he came in. He did some cool stuff, you know, he gave the finger to the IMF, I think it was, you know, kicked out the military base in Manta, American military base in Manta. But really, his major legacy is the largest licensing of land for extractive industries in the history of Ecuador, much of it in indigenous territory. I mean, there have been indigenous leaders who commented on his presidency saying he was neither right wing or left wing, he was just extractivist. So that's his legacy, really. And then his predecessors or his successors, Lenin Moreno, Guillermo Lasso, have only just ramped up these extractive policies, essentially.
Leading to right now, with Noboa taking out hundreds of millions of dollars of more IMF loans that will only open the country further to foreign extraction.
Exactly, and taking a recent trip to Canada to...
Thank you to this episode's sponsor, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it's that far off from there being robot dogs being set on indigenous people defending their lands, to be honest. I mean, Noboa, he recently went to Canada drumming up international investment for mega mining projects in the Sierra, which are many planned. But he also, there's quite a lot of gang violence in Ecuador at the moment, and he's exploiting or has exploited the public's fear. He organized a public referendum in April and got the people to approve permanent militarization, essentially. So now the army can always support the police when dealing with control security issues without him having to declare a state of emergency. So the future doesn't look too rosy, considering that extractive industries never give up. The indigenous movement never gives up either, so the stage is set for some further clashes, I would say.
What do you think the future of indigenous resistance in Ecuador looks like?
I guess we could end on a positive note. There have been several victories recently, legal victories for the rights of nature, which have annulled several mining and projects, which is really good news.
And for those who don't know, the rights of nature are enshrined in the Ecuadorian constitution.
Yes, they are indeed, exactly. And back in 2020, on the anniversary of the big October 2019 uprising, I interviewed one of the women who'd had a key role in organising that uprising. And I asked her exactly this question: what is the future of indigenous resistance in Ecuador, and what has been the impact of the protest in 2019? And what she said to me was this: despite the increasingly militaristic state, the uprising gave a boost to the social sectors, especially the indigenous movement, and we're not willing to lose it. In both urban and rural areas, hope for social organisation grew, as did politicization and the questioning of political and economic power, hegemony and capitalism. We continue fighting day by day for our dignity, end quote. So, all we can really say is la lucha sigue, or the struggle continues.
Thank you. I kind of just want to wind down. I know that the information shared in the way that it's been presented is not, in the style of the classic proles. But again, the reason that I wanted to do this episode to begin with is because Marxism, right, is not just a way of evaluating history or politics among those who self-identify as Marxists. It is an aperture through which we can view other people, other struggles, other countries, and try to understand them, see what we can learn, and see how we can be of service. And I guess, for anyone, Beth, obviously for you, Justin, Martin, me, as we share all of this, what stands out? Like, what do you think are the takeaways that we can glean?
For me, I think it's just a matter of kind of taking the experiences of these various indigenous groups and recognizing what is important to them as a community and how they navigate the world that we're in, understanding their place in that world, and then kind of thinking about how we could, like I said earlier, kind of create a system in the future that would serve them, as well as, allow for the world to modernize around them. Because obviously we're not going to be able to stop the march of progress.
But certainly we can't stop the march of progress because it's inherent in the passage of time, but we can interrogate what progress is, what it looks like, what it means to us, and what growth and development are. And to your point from earlier, Justin, we have seen other experiments try to engage in this in different and frankly, like much better ways.
Sure. Is it perfect? No, of course not. But that's why we learn. That's why we listen to these kind of stories so that we can learn how to make the world better. Another thing, again, I'll bring up the Soviet Union because it's what I know the most.
Good. I'm glad. Because if you didn't, I was going to ask you about it.
I thought earlier about the tourism industry, right? And how the Soviet system was built around holidays, essentially like a timeshare system, right? So that people would go on holiday based on where they wanted to go, but also based on how many other people were going to be going there at that time, et cetera, et cetera. And so that you're not like, there aren't these destinations that just get like instantly converted into this like Ibiza, right? Or like Tijuana or whatever, you know what I mean? And I think that that's just yet another way. Like there are other ways that we can think about the way that we impact the world around us.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the key takeaways, and everyone, again, you can hear about this much more in depth at the full interview on the Patreon, but there's a big shift, right, in worldview. In the West or in the westernized world, we see things as de facto individual and individuated unless otherwise specified. But not to collapse all Indigenous people into a monolith, but there is a recurring theme here where things are assumed to be collective unless otherwise specified. And that shift, especially for those of us, again, because we see the tendency all the time, and especially online, because it's what does well online, but there is a sort of like neoliberalized communist left that, despite being communist in name and in self-identity, actually their attitudes are hyper-individual, very personalized, very intolerant to people who have different ways of thinking. And not to suggest that there's no space for argument, because as Beth was saying earlier, I mean, some of these meetings go on for hours and hours and hours and hours and maybe multiple days and over different times, and you're hearing people with diametrically opposed views, but they build the discipline to continue to sit in community with one another. And I think that there's something broader that we all, this is my personal opinion, but something that comes up a lot, I think, that is referenced throughout this conversation, although not explicitly said. We in the westernized world, we in the imperial core especially, have a culture of disposability, whether we're talking about just waste or actual human beings who we think, oh, they don't think like us or they haven't come to the same agreement. I mean, the Remolino community has conflict with other members of their own family, but still when they speak about them as we are part of the same nation. We are part of the same people. And they don't see them, again, as foregone people, as lost people, but as people who might have their own awakening and desire to come back to right alignment with their land, with the earth, etc. And so that's something that really stood out to me. Another thing that I continue to try to tease out throughout the conversation that I want to bring everybody's attention to, again, is broadening our understanding of where the front line of struggle is. Maybe if you're listening, you are a person who can't or isn't interested in, for whatever reason, engaging, like you said earlier, Beth, in direct action or in armed conflict. Maybe you're a disabled person, or maybe you're older, or maybe, for whatever, you have children, for whatever reason. But as we see here, the front line of struggle is diverse. And I think that's something that we can all learn is we have to learn to orient ourselves toward what can I do? Because I think that there's a sort of pervasive mental narrative that I see all the time that is like, I can't, or I'm not interested, or I'm not willing to do this one specific thing, this action that's being called of me or of people in this moment. And therefore I'm disenfranchised, I'm disconnected, I guess this is just not for me. And it has a very de-radicalizing effect. But something that we can learn again and again from the indigenous people of the Ecuadorian Amazon is that there is always a point of struggle that is right in front of me, that is right in front of you, that is right in front of all of us that you can continue to engage in, and that all of those things matter. Are they always the tipping point? No. But for those of us who are on the revolutionary left, when that time comes, there has to be as many, as I said before, alternatives in place, as many possibilities in place, as many other things up and running to allow people to engage in struggle meaningfully. And that when we have our world to win, when that opportunity arises, there are things in place for people to participate in. And those are kind of just my takeaways, things that I thought about as we were listening to this conversation.
The best way to support the community of Sequoia de Molino is through our crowdfunding campaign, which has been going for 3 years now. It's on GoFundMe under Secopai Indigenous Amazon Youth Foundation. And we have used it for so many things which have made all the difference, basically, to the resistance of the community, from buying a flour mill for the medicinal plants laboratory, materials for women's craft workshop, internet connection, things for the plant laboratory like jars, labels, bottles, beeswax. We paid for a delegation from the community to visit Sadiaku. We paid for the materials we needed to receive a delegation from Sadiaku in the community, materials to build the kindergarten, all kinds of things. The young Sekopai make decisions as a group on how to spend the funds, and all the expenses are published transparently on the crowdfunding campaign. So that would be a wonderful way to support the community.
Well, that about does it for this episode. Thank you so much, Beth, and we will link all that stuff in the show notes so that people can easily access it all. We also want to thank our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The latest paid subscribers since the last episode are Comrade Conrad, Swedish Tanky, Anna, Mattia98, Nicole, Dawnbreaker, Carol Gardens Kami, Comrade Benjamin, Revolutionary's Garden, Opal, Santiago, and John Brown Did Nothing Wrong. And as our first Vanguard, who gets their name read out every episode, huge thanks to the ultimate comrade, B. Once again, if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so over at patreon.com/prolspod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolspod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like all that algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Death to America.
They envision the entire world Sovietized communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style.
Stalin.
Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro. Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro.